17th of March. I haven't put out a broadcast for a little while because, as usual, the news is a bit thin on the ground. But what I've managed to glean from the papers last week and British television news has been pretty poor fare, really. I mean, the most notable thing, according to the BBC and the mainstream media and English newspapers in Scotland, has been the fact that there was a welding crack in a ferry. A welding crack in a ferry which took one day to repair, and the ferry returned to service immediately afterwards. So what was the point in the news story? Well, it was just another attempt, really, by the mainstream media to come up with some kind of SNP ferry bad story, and it flopped as usual, because nobody is the slightest bit interested in a minor welding crack in a ferry going across the Arran. It's just not news. However, there is some news, and John Swinney has announced that he is going to be holding a wind energy conference or symposium of some kind in Scotland. Now, this appears to be an event at which Mr. Swinney is intending to presumably offer for sale some more plots of Scottish seabed for foreign investors to come along and build some new wind farms. Now, this kind of activity has always bothered me because, according to Mr. Swinney, this is him trying to expand Scotland's wind energy industry. But in actual fact, Scotland doesn't have any indigenous wind energy industry at all. It's all being handled by multinational corporations and syndicates of foreign investors who come in and build these wind turbines and connect them not even to the Scottish grid system, but simply straight down to the English grid system, where there is an insatiable demand for clean energy, which the English generators can't seem to find the wherewithal to actually generate themselves. So to me, this sounds like a sell-off of yet more of Scotland's valuable natural assets. In this particular case, bits of seabed or areas of the coastline of Scotland where there's lots of wind, in which it's easy to, I guess, just sell a license to whoever wants to develop it. But the last time this was done, the sell-off raised just a handful of hundreds of millions of pounds, far less than the billions of pounds such contracts are actually worth in terms of the energy that they produce. So if Mr. Swinney is attempting to present himself as a friend of Scottish business, well, he'll need to do a bit better than this. This is really just another sop to international neoliberalism writ large. We know that Kate Forbes is also at the helm of the entire neoliberal experiment in Scotland, where basically any parts of Scotland that people want to buy are up for sale, including the massive special economic zones and free ports, which Kate Forbes has already signed off on, and which we are stuck with for the next 2.5 decades, according to the agreements that have been written. But those agreements, of course, only stand so long as Scotland is stuck inside the Union. And that brings me to the third item on today's programme, which is the recent news that Salvo has finally had its petition for Scotland to be listed for decolonisation delivered to the Secretary General of the United Nations at the UNHQ in New York. Now, this is something which most, if not all, mainstream media has utterly and completely ignored. And obviously there's a reason for that, because England does not want the rest of the population, particularly in Scotland, to know that the Union is in fact just a big lie. The Union Treaty was never ratified. In fact, as soon as it was signed, it was discarded, and England virtually just marched in and annexed the place. And in 1776, after the Battle of Culloden, 600 military garrisons were set up across Scotland in order to subdue the Highlands, basically, and to denude them of people by transporting them to the colonies or slave camps in British colonies overseas, or simply just killing them. Anybody who said that they didn't want the Union was basically going to get slaughtered, chased out of their homes and their cottages, and crofts burned to the ground. And that caused a major exodus of Highlanders to places like Glasgow. But anyway, that is conveniently ignored by British historians who like to present Scotland as being in some kind of voluntary union. But because of the news leaking out gradually through, well, sites like this and others, like through Scottish Prism, maybe the two Davies, and various other online podcasts, such as those made by Norrie Hunter at Caledon Media, people now know in Scotland that they have now got representation at the United Nations. And the historical documents which have been compiled by Salvo's diligent researchers prove that Scotland has never been part of a voluntary union, and that the union itself doesn't even exist because the treaty was never ratified, and England simply added Scotland to its own kingdom under its own crown, and that was basically that, according to England. But in their rush to take Scotland over in the 18th century, England forgot a critical step, and that would have been to actually ratify the treaty, which would have created the union. But they didn't do that. They forgot, or they just thought they didn't really need to do it because they were so much more powerful in Scotland, and they could subdue the Highlanders by simply shoving great big garrisons all over the Highlands, which they of course did. Anyway, the news of this development has gradually leaked out onto the Twitter sphere, or the excretosphere, or whatever it's called under Elon Musk, and the trolls, the unionist trolls, are starting to get a bit fed up. And that has meant my own pages being polluted by all kinds of racist tropes and idiots from all over the UK pitching in to tell us what we can and can't do. However, it's prompted for me a major blocking spree, and there's nothing more satisfying than blocking these idiots or revealing them as the uneducated and unknowledgeable, ignorant people that they actually are. However, that doesn't matter. The fact that it's got them annoyed is a testament to the fact that it actually is beginning to get out there. The news has reached the unionists that their union is about to be unmasked, and that is really annoying them. And if nothing else, if Salvo never achieved anything else, then this is a huge badge of honour. It's a massive media and propaganda success for our side for a change, which has had to suffer from constant bombardments of mainstream UK media because we're not allowed to have our own television stations, our own newspapers, or any other medium which says anything different from what the British state wants it to say. We all know this. Now, recently, there was another piece of news that I picked up on from Peter Bell, who monitors things quite carefully, and he's pointing out that Kenny McCaskill, the leader of ALBA, has been making a statement now acknowledging, and this is the first time I've heard a mainstream Scottish politician acknowledge this, that Scotland is a colony. And he went on to, I think in fairly simple terms, describe why that was without going into the kind of detail which Salvo has provided. However, the fact that the word colony and the word decolonization have now entered common parlance within the activist groups on these channels, but also the fact that it is now crept in to the discourse of, should we say, conventional politicians like Mr. McCaskill is an interesting development. Who will be next in the pro-independence parties to acknowledge that we're a colony, or to acknowledge that we can be decolonized by the UN? Now, before you rush to say to me, but the United Kingdom has a seat on the Security Council of the UN and could veto this attempt, well, you're wrong, because the United Nations is not as simple as that. The Security Council of the UN deals with international relations between superpowers and big players, likes of America, Russia, China, the UK, France, Germany, Australia, New Zealand, all of the major countries which feature in the UN. International security as a major foreign concern. However, they don't have the veto power over what's known as the C24 Committee. Now, the C24 Committee is the United Nations body. Now, this is an independent body within the UN, which deals only with requests for decolonization from non-self-governing territories. And Scotland is exactly that. We are non-self-governing. We have no powers to do anything outside of managing our own internal affairs, and we have no access to regular democracy because it's been denied us. One referendum on the Union in 317 years is hardly democracy. I don't think anybody would say that once in 300 odd years is any kind of democratic system. It is simply when the United Kingdom felt it was safe to allow the Scots to have a shot at pretending that they could become independent. And losing the referendum in 2014 does not mean that we have agreed to join the United Kingdom. We never did agree. There was no debate about it in 1707. There was no democracy for the people of Scotland in 1707. There were simply about a dozen negotiators on one side and a dozen negotiators on the other, and there was a naval blockade, and there was the threat of invasion and starvation and trade barriers put up by England to prevent the Scots from trading, all of which forced the union upon us. And England was so confident in this union that they never bothered with the treaty at all after that, and they just simply went on to annex the country and have been happily plundering our resources ever since. So what Mr. McCaskill has said is broadly true. We are a colony. Whatever England chooses to call Scotland, we are treated as a colony. All of the indicators which define a colony within the United Nations have already been met by Scotland. And that is what the petition from Salvo actually contains. It contains all of the ingredients that Scotland possesses which define it as a colony. In our case, a resource exploitation colony of England, because England is currently reaping all the rewards for all of Scotland's resources, and Scotland gets virtually nothing back other than a few shekels, a few pennies, which Mr. Swinney might be able to negotiate in some form of limited licenses for people to build massive wind farms in our territorial waters and export the energy wherever they like, without us actually getting a penny for it. I have asked Mr. Swinney in reply to his post on X if he'd care to tell us what the percentage of profits the Scottish Government expects to demand from the companies that he's going to negotiate with. I'd be looking forward to some kind of reply at some point in the future, but I'm not holding my breath. I don't believe there will be any continuing income from these wind energy farms that are being set up by these corporations, because that's not in Scotland's power to do that. Because energy, as we all know, is a so-called reserved matter to Westminster, one of the many powers that we don't have, and one of the many reasons why we are a colony and why the UN will agree that we are. Now, why is it important for the UN to recognise Scotland as a colony? The simple answer to that is that if we are a colony and we have no access to democracy in which to vote on whether we remain a colony or not, then the United Nations can list us for decolonization, a process which they have been undertaking for many countries for many decades since the founding of the UN itself. And there are probably dozens of former British colonies, which are now countries themselves, which are probably going to queue up to support Scotland and to sponsor its efforts to be decolonised. Now, I know a lot of people are sort of disappointed when they hear the term decolonisation, because they think, well, this is going to take ages, and how is it going to be done? Well, the simple answer to that is once we have decolonisation status and the UN accepts that we are a colony, then that means we have the right to self-determination, and that can be publicly endorsed by the UN. Although they're not going to declare independence for Scotland, that is not what we're asking for here. What we're asking for is the same human rights that every other country in the world enjoys, the right to self-determination, which is part of the founding principle, if you like, of the entire United Nations. So that would allow us the freedom ourselves to hold a referendum on whether we stay in the Union or not. How that is achieved is actually up to us. There are two schools of thought here. Peter Bell has written that he feels that the Scottish Parliament is the only institution Scotland has which would have the power to legislate for another referendum, if only its government, its majority, if it's pro-independence, would actually do something about it. But that is another question. Sarah Salas from Salvo disagrees and says that there are provisions in the Scottish Constitution which means that when we are absent our Parliament, in other words, when a fully functioning national Parliament is not in evidence, and I think you could say that devolution is not that, then the Scots are perfectly within their rights to form their own government in exile, if you like. What that's called is a subject of some debate, but it would take the form of a parallel government. In other words, a parallel parliament in which Scotland's interests are represented in the full and has the powers to call a referendum if our devolved parliament, which is essentially a colonial arm of the English state, would not do that. And in that case, our constitution does allow us to do that. So there are many questions still remaining to be answered, but the key thing here is, once the UN recognises Scotland as a colony of England, then everything politically in the Scottish landscape changes completely. It alters the balance of power and equalises it so that Scotland has exactly the same rights to self-determination as any other country. And that means it takes the power to interfere in the political process of gaining independence away from the British state. And that is why in 2014 we lost the independence referendum, because the British state ran it, broke its own rules of purdah to create a new offer known as the vow, which we all know in infamy wasn't true, in order to deter us from voting for independence in the first place. And there were many other irregularities within that referendum which went unchallenged afterwards. Perhaps the Scots politicians felt there was no point because there would be simply no way to undo it or rerun it. Either way, the UN would oversee any new referendum, and they would be observing it to make sure it was transparent, it was entirely fair, and that both sides were equally represented, unlike the last time when the British state had 99% of the media under its control, and where the independence campaign had no media with which to put out its message other than this kind of media. And that could change after the UN recognises our right to self-determination as a colony. So things have changed, and the trolls from the unionist sides are very scared of this. They don't know how to deal with it. They are currently trying to say that it's all nonsense and we're just making it up. Well, that's what they would like to believe. But when the UN makes the decision on this, they won't be able to say that anymore, because then they would have to question international law, something which none of them is even qualified to comment on. And many of them are not even knowledgeable enough to comment on Scottish politics, simply because they have no idea what the actual constitutional situation really is. However, now we know, we'll be able to do something about it. So please keep the faith, and remember that Salvo is acting in the interests of everyone in Scotland, not just the pro-independence campaign. It's also acting in the interests of those who still think that being in the Union is a good idea. And no matter what the UN says, what will be guaranteed afterwards is that those people who do want to stay in the United Kingdom and think that it's worthwhile will get a fair vote. Only this time they will not be backed up by the full might of the United Kingdom, and there will not be any interference from the UK in the process. That will be closely monitored and guarded by the UN, so that can't happen. And that is what will change the balance when it comes to actually voting. And that will equalise the two sides and allow both to campaign on an equal footing, which is the only fair way to decide this matter. Anyway, that's it from Inde-Car today. I hope you've enjoyed the programme. I also hope that Peter Bell's question when he said, is Kenny the one? Is Kenny McCaskill the man to open the door to the whole issue of decolonisation for the first time in mainstream politics in Scotland? Well, that remains to be seen. But I have some faith that it's leaked out already, and I think the politicians jumping on the bandwagon now, and Kenny being the first, is the first sign that they know now that this genie cannot be put back in the lamp. The toothpaste has come out of the tube and it can't be pushed back in. And so now they have to deal with a new political reality. And that should be the start of a trickle and then a flood of politicians finally waking up and realising that decolonisation is the enabler for Scotland to have a referendum on leaving the Union. I'll leave you with that thought. See you soon. Bye for now.